An undercover billionaire checks into his own hotel, expecting to observe in silence. But what he sees stops him cold. While the staff treat guests with indifference and cruelty, one maid stands out, offering kindness despite her own struggles. Moved beyond words, he secretly pays off her entire debt. But just when he thinks his act of generosity is enough, an unbelievable twist turns his world upside down. Stick around as this powerful story unfolds and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If this story grabs your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. Ezra Caldwell pulled the hood of his sweatshirt lower, his cap casting a shadow over his face as he stepped through the towering glass doors of the Montclair Royale. The hotel's grand chandeliers cast golden light across the marble floor, their glow reflecting off the polished surfaces of the lobby. This place was luxury embodied, his empire, his brand, a sanctuary for the wealthy elite who measured status by the number of stars attached to their accommodations. Yet tonight, as he approached the check-in desk, he was just another man. No entourage, no tailored suits, no billionaire name attached to his presence. Just Ezra Cole, an unassuming guest dressed in a hoodie and jeans. The receptionist barely looked up, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she muttered a rehearsed, impersonal greeting. Name? Ezra Cole, he said, handing over his credit card. She took it, her eyes flicking between him and the platinum rectangle in her hands. Her lips pursed slightly before she scanned the card once, then again, her hesitation betraying the judgment forming in her mind. "We need to verify your card," she said, her tone shifting into something clipped, professional, but distant. She glanced at the security guard standing near the entrance, a silent signal passing between them. Ezra followed her gaze, watching as the guard subtly straightened, his focus sharpening on him. Ezra exhaled slowly, his grip on the counter tightening for a fraction of a second before he forced himself to relax. He had seen this happen too many times before, the polite suspicion, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Does he belong here? Minutes ago, a well-dressed white man had breezed through check-in with nothing but a nod of acknowledgement, the receptionist offering him a complimentary cocktail voucher along with his key card. But Ezra? He was still being verified. After a hushed exchange with her colleague, the receptionist finally returned his card. "You're in suite 1204, she said, sliding the key toward him with an artificial politeness. "Enjoy your stay." Taking the key, Ezra pocketed it without a word. As he turned toward the elevators, he felt the weight of the security guard's stare trailing him. They had no idea who he was, and that was exactly the point. The suite was nothing short of extravagant, a perfectly curated blend of modern luxury. The king-sized bed was covered in pristine white linens, the soft hum of ambient lighting filling the space with warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a view most guests would pay thousands for. Ezra barely glanced at it. He wasn't here for the luxury. He had come to see his empire from the inside, to watch how his business functioned when no one knew he was watching. As he set his bag down, a faint rustling caught his attention. He turned toward the desk, his eyes landing on a woman in a maid's uniform. She froze the moment she saw him, her grip tightening on the cloth she had been using to polish the desk lamp. Her expression flickered between surprise and panic, as if she had been caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir." Her voice was rushed, her movements suddenly frantic as she hurried to gather her supplies. "I thought you wouldn't be checking in until later. I'll be out in just a moment." Ezra watched her closely. She wasn't just startled, she was afraid. The way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her cart, suggested she was used to being reprimanded, maybe even treated harshly. "You don't have to rush," he said, his tone steady, measured. She hesitated, clearly thrown off by his response. Most guests either ignored her or barked orders. She had probably learned to move quickly and silently, to avoid confrontation, to exist without drawing attention. Still, she nodded, adjusting her grip on the cleaning cart. Before she could leave, she paused for a moment, then placed a neatly folded towel on the nightstand. "Fresh towels," she said softly. "And I left an extra bottle of water. Some guests don't like the tap." Ezra stilled. It was such a small thing, but it spoke volumes. She hadn't been obligated to do that. No one was watching her. No one would have known if she had skipped the extra details. It was just pure human decency. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a beat before answering. "Mira." Something about the name stirred something in him, but he pushed the thought aside. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear before glancing at him briefly. "Have a good night, sir." Ezra found himself nodding back. For the first time today, someone had treated him like a person, and he wouldn't forget it. Ezra sat in the dim glow of his suite, leaning back against the plush couch as he scrolled through emails on his phone. He wasn't here to relax. He was here to watch. Over the next few days, he observed the hotel staff, noting how they interacted with guests. The wealthy were pampered, their every need catered to without hesitation. But those who looked ordinary, those who weren't flashing designer suits and expensive watches, were met with indifference at best, quiet condescension at worst. And then there was Mira. He saw her assisting an elderly couple struggling with their luggage at check-in, stepping in where the front desk staff ignored them. She didn't just carry their bags. She walked them to the elevator, ensured they had everything they needed, even fetched an extra pillow when she overheard the older woman mentioning a bad back. Later that night, he caught sight of her again near the back exit. A homeless woman sat shivering against the alley wall, ignored by everyone who passed. But Mira, moving discreetly, placed a wrapped sandwich and a cup of coffee beside her before hurrying back inside. She never waited for a thank you. She never even looked back. Ezra leaned against the balcony railing, watching from above. He had seen people donate to charity with cameras flashing, CEOs give to causes for tax write-offs. But this was kindness without an audience, and it was rare. For the first time in years, something in him shifted. He had come to the Montclair Royale to see his business from the inside, but maybe, just maybe, he was meant to find something else, or rather, someone. Ezra sat in the dim glow of his suite, his mind replaying everything he had observed in the past few days. The way the hotel staff overlooked anyone who didn't radiate wealth, the way Mira moved through her shifts with quiet resilience, offering kindness where no one else did. He had come here expecting to scrutinize the business he built, to see if his hotels truly lived up to their 5-star reputation. Instead, he found himself watching one person. Mira didn't know it, but she had left an impression on him. Her small acts of kindness, her willingness to help others despite her own struggles. He had seen plenty of people feign generosity when cameras were around, but true goodness, when no one was watching, was rare. Tonight, Ezra didn't scroll through investment reports or property evaluations. He read something else. Mira Carter. Age, 28. Employee at the Montclair Royale for 3 years. No record of disciplinary action. A stellar work ethic, yet still stuck at the lowest paying position in the hotel. And then the part that made his stomach tighten. Crippling debt. It wasn't just a few missed credit card payments or student loans. It was medical bills, emergency expenses, and the kind of financial burden that crushed dreams before they could ever take flight. She was drowning in it, and yet she still put others before herself. Ezra rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone. A quiet decision settled in him, as simple and effortless as breathing. He was going to change her life. The next afternoon, Mira stood in the back of the break room, her fingers wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. The exhaustion clung to her bones. She had barely made rent this month. The bills were piling up, suffocating in their urgency, but she kept pushing forward. What choice did she have? She took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste wake her up, when the head of hotel accounting, Mr. Langford, strode in. He was a short, sharp-faced man who rarely spoke to employees unless they were in trouble. "Mira Carter," he called. His tone was neutral, but something about it sent a flicker of unease through her chest. She quickly set her coffee down and stepped forward. "Yes, sir." He handed her an envelope. "You'll want to read this." Frowning, Mira opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the document inside. The words didn't register at first. They made no sense. Account balance. She blinked, her mind scrambling to process the impossible. I don't understand," she stammered, her hands gripping the paper tighter. "Your debts," Langford said, adjusting his glasses. "They've been paid, completely." The break room seemed to tilt. The walls blurred at the edges as her pulse roared in her ears. This had to be a mistake, some cruel joke. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not possible. Langford's expression remained unreadable. It came from an anonymous donor. The paperwork is legitimate. Mira's breath shuddered out of her. She felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had suddenly vanished. She had spent years buried under the weight of those numbers, working double shifts, cutting corners, sacrificing every dream she had just to stay afloat. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Her fingers clenched around the letter, her heart pounding against her ribs. Who would do this? And more importantly, why? Mira paced the length of her tiny apartment, the letter still clutched in her hand. She had called the bank, the loan offices, anyone who might tell her this was an error. But every answer was the same. It was real. An anonymous payment had wiped her debt clean. No name attached. No explanation. She should have felt relief, but instead she felt something else. Suspicion. Nothing in life came without a cost. Her mind churned through possibilities. A scam? A setup? Was someone expecting something in return? She couldn't let it go. Mira spent the next few days quietly investigating, asking careful questions around the hotel. She knew the kind of people who stayed here. Wealthy, powerful men who threw money around without blinking. And then, one name kept surfacing. Ezra Cole, the guest in Suite 1204. The man in the hoodie who never asked for anything, never drew attention, yet always seemed to be watching. Something about him had unsettled her from the beginning. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that felt out of place. Like he was too aware of his surroundings, too observant for a regular guest. Was it him? It didn't make sense. Why would a stranger do this for her? There was only one way to find out. Mira knocked on the door of Suite 1204, her fingers curling into fists as she steadied herself. A moment later, the door opened. Ezra stood in the entryway, still in his hoodie and cap, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mira took a slow breath, forcing the lump down her throat. Did you do this? Ezra didn't feign ignorance. He studied her, his dark eyes calm, almost expectant. Would it change anything if I did? Mira's heart pounded. Why? Her voice cracked slightly. Why me? He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Because I could. That's not an answer, she snapped, her emotions rising. People don't just do things like this for no reason. Ezra didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. Mira hesitated, but then she saw it. The photograph. It lay on the desk near the window, slightly worn at the edges. Her chest tightened as she stepped forward, reaching for it with trembling fingers. She turned it over, her breath catching in her throat. It was a picture of her mother. Her hands shook as she slowly looked up at Ezra. Why do you have this? His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes shifted, a quiet realization settling between them. Because, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, your mother was the woman I had to leave behind. She was pregnant when I left, and I spent years searching for her. I never found her. Mira's breath came in shallow gasps, her entire world tilted. She died when I was little, she choked out. I never knew who my father was. Ezra's jaw tightened, emotion flickering behind his gaze. He had spent years looking for a woman he thought he had lost forever, and now, standing in front of him, was the daughter he never knew he had. Mira's fingers trembled as she gripped the photograph, her mother's face staring back at her from another lifetime. She could barely process the words Ezra had just spoken, could barely breathe past the lump forming in her throat. This had to be some kind of mistake, some cruel misunderstanding. Yet deep down, something in her told her it wasn't. She lifted her gaze to him, searching his face for deception, but all she found was something raw, something unspoken, a man carrying a weight he had buried for years. You're lying, she whispered, but even as she said it, her voice wavered. This doesn't make sense. Ezra exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as if the past had just crashed into him all at once. I never stopped looking for her, he admitted, his voice quieter now. When I left, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I'd come back and find her, but when I did, she was gone. No trace, no forwarding address. It was like she had vanished. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening before he continued. I spent years searching. I hired private investigators, scoured records, looked through hospitals. I never found her. And I never knew she had a child. I never knew she had you. Mira's pulse pounded in her ears as she struggled to hold on to reality. Her mother had never spoken about her father. Not once. She had only ever said that he was gone, and that was that. For years, Mira had assumed he had abandoned them, that he had never cared. And now, here he was, standing before her, unraveling a truth she had never expected. Her breath hitched as something else dawned on her. "You paid my debts," she whispered, her fingers tightening around the paper in her hands. "Why?" Ezra's lips pressed together, his expression unreadable, but his answer came without hesitation. "Because I could." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's not a reason." His gaze softened, something heavy sitting behind his eyes. "Because I failed once," he murmured. "I left the one person I swore I would come back to, and I lost her. I didn't want to fail again." Mira shook her head, stepping back as emotions warred within her. This man, this stranger, was telling her that he was the father she had spent her entire life believing didn't exist, that he had never abandoned her by choice but by circumstance, that he had tried and failed to find the woman who had raised her alone, only to discover the truth far too late. It was too much. "I need to go," she whispered, her voice barely holding together as she turned toward the door. Ezra didn't stop her. He didn't call after her. He simply watched as she left, letting her go as easily as he had lost her mother all those years ago. Mira didn't know how long she walked through the city, her thoughts spiraling out of control. The streets blurred around her, neon lights flashing, voices mixing into an incoherent hum. She felt like she was suffocating under the weight of something she hadn't been prepared for. Her entire life, she had carried the belief that her father had chosen to walk away, that he had never wanted to be in the picture. Now, that belief was cracking, making way for something new, something even more painful. If what Ezra had told her was true, then she had spent years hating a man who had spent years searching for them. She reached the small cafe near her apartment, the one she always went to when she needed a moment to think. Sliding into a booth in the corner, she wrapped her hands around the cup of tea the waiter brought her without asking, was it even possible to accept what Ezra had told her? Would it change anything if she did? The logical part of her told her that it wouldn't. Her mother was gone. That wouldn't change. Her struggles, her sacrifices, the life she had built for herself, they had all been shaped by the belief that she had no one else to rely on but herself. But another part of her, the part she had buried long ago, the part that had once longed for answers, wasn't so sure. As she sat there, lost in thought, her phone vibrated against the table. She didn't recognize the number at first, but something told her to answer. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was urgency beneath it. "Miss Carter?" "This is James Holloway. I work for Mr. Caldwell. I was asked to find something years ago, and I believe I've finally uncovered it. I think you'll want to see this." Mira sat across from James Holloway in a quiet office, her hands clasped tightly together. The man was in his late 50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of person who seemed to know everything about everyone. "I was hired by Mr. Caldwell over 15 years ago," he began, sliding a manila folder across the table toward her. "Back then, he was desperate to find your mother. He had exhausted every lead, but I never stopped looking. I never expected to find anything after all these years, but last week, something surfaced. A storage unit registered under her name. It had been untouched for over a decade." Mira hesitated before flipping open the folder. Inside were copies of old documents, faded photographs, images of her mother she had never seen before. There were letters, too, addressed to an Ezra Caldwell, never sent. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked one up, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Ezra, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you're still looking for us, or if you gave up long ago. But I can't hold on to the anger anymore. I loved you once. Maybe I still do. But I won't raise our child waiting for a man who may never return. If you ever find this, know that I tried to move on. But I never stopped hoping that you would find her, that you would find Mira. She deserves to know the truth. She deserves to know that you never abandoned her." Mira's fingers shook as she lowered the letter, her vision blurring. All these years, she had believed her mother had erased her father from their lives. But her mother had been waiting, too, hoping. She had never let go of the belief that he would find them. And now here she was, sitting across from a man who had spent his entire life trying to fix his greatest mistake. Taking a shaky breath, she closed the folder and stood up. She didn't know if she could forgive him. She didn't know if she was ready to let him in. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep running from the truth. It was time to face it. Mira stood outside the Montclair Royale, staring up at the towering hotel that had unknowingly housed the missing pieces of her life. Her fingers curled around the manila folder, the weight of her mother's unsent letters pressing against her palm. For years, she had lived in the certainty that she had been unwanted, abandoned without a second thought. Now, that belief was unraveling, and she didn't know if she could survive the weight of what it left behind. She exhaled sharply and walked into the lobby, her steps fueled by something between hesitation and resolve. She barely registered the opulence around her, barely noticed the guests and employees moving about their daily routines. The only thing that mattered now was the man waiting in Suite 1204. When she reached the door, she raised her hand to knock, but it opened before she could. Ezra stood there, looking as though sleep had evaded him for days. His normally sharp eyes were clouded with something she couldn't quite name: hope, regret, maybe even fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. "You came back," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Mira stepped past him into the suite and placed the folder on the desk. Her fingers traced the worn edges before she turned to face him. "I met with James Holloway," she said, her voice steady. "He showed me what my mother left behind." Ezra swallowed hard. "I told him to never stop looking." Mira studied him, searching for cracks in his guarded expression. "You never did you?" His answer was immediate. "I never did." She let out a slow, shaky breath. "I don't know what to do with this, Ezra. I don't know how to." She gestured vaguely between them, frustration creeping into her voice. "This is too much. It's too fast. I spent my whole life believing you never wanted me, and now suddenly you're standing here telling me you searched for us? That I was never abandoned?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Ezra took a careful step toward her. "I know this doesn't erase what you've been through," he said. "I know it doesn't fix the years we lost, but if there's any chance that we can rebuild something, I'll take it. I don't want to lose you, Mira. Not again." She closed her eyes briefly, her heart pounding. "And what if I can't do this? What if I don't know how?" Ezra let out a breath. "Then I'll wait." The air between them was thick with uncertainty, but for the first time, it wasn't filled with anger or blame, just the weight of two lives that had been pulled apart and unexpectedly woven back together. Mira wanted to be angry. She wanted to hold on to the resentment that had kept her moving forward all these years. But the letters in that folder, the truth in Ezra's tired eyes, they wouldn't let her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to walk away. Taking a deep breath, she lifted her chin. "I don't know what this means yet," she admitted. "But I think I want to find out." Ezra's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally eased, even just a little. "That's all I could ask for." Mira nodded, letting the moment settle between them. She turned toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. "Don't wait forever, Ezra," she murmured. "Just be here when I'm ready." And with that, she walked away, not running, not fleeing, but leaving a door open instead of slamming it shut. Ezra watched her go, a quiet understanding settling in his chest. He had spent his life chasing ghosts, trying to fix what had already been broken. But now, for the first time, he had something real to hold on to. Mira hadn't promised him anything, but she had given him a chance. And that was enough. Life is full of unexpected twists, and sometimes the people we thought had left us were searching all along. Ezra and Mira's story is one of fate, forgiveness, and second chances, but not everyone finds closure so easily. What would you do in Mira's place? Would you give Ezra a chance, or is the past too much to overcome? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, made you think, or kept you hooked until the very end, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping and emotional storytelling. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey with us. Stay tuned for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And as always, Remember, sometimes second chances come when we least expect them. See you next time.